Hi, Dan Stein here, president of FAIR, and welcome to another Facebook Live, brought to you by the great staff at FAIR that I'm privileged to work with. And today we're going to really drill down into a couple exciting issues. I'm joined today by Matt O'Brien, FAIR's Director of Research, who also brings a strong pedigree from USCIS, Citizenship Immigration Services, and anti-fraud work. He's also practiced law, and he's an attorney and knows immigration law, policies, and procedures inside and out. But today we're going to be talking about a couple important issues. One, to tell you how controversial immigration is, how many other issues do you see where family members start fighting with one another publicly over the policy positions one of them is taking professionally in his work with the administration? Name one other issue where you start to see family members attack another family member. In this case, we're talking about Mr. Gosler, Stephen Miller's uncle. Now, Stephen Miller, of course, is a special assistant to the president, and he's also widely credited with being one of the major intellectual forces behind the Trump administration's policies. Now, apparently, Mr. Miller has not spent a lot of time with his uncle, but his uncle has decided to get his 20 minutes of fame on the backs of his nephew. Even though he hardly knows him, and naturally the client media, the opposition media, the campaign arm of the Democratic National Committee essentially, has given this guy a lot of ink, a lot of attention. The truth of the matter is, as Matt will explain in a few minutes, the premise of Mr. Gosler's argument, by the way, he's a neuroscientist, a neuromedical physician. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never had an interesting policy discussion with any medical doctor in my entire life. Lovely people, medical doctors, but I wouldn't go to them for political advice. I really wouldn't go to them for investment advice or a whole bunch of other things, maybe advice about something on my skin or something like that, but I wouldn't go to them for political advice. But apparently this guy knows all about the history of immigration. His basic argument is that because Stephen Miller is of Jewish heritage and background and ethnicity, and his parents, or great-great-grandfather came from back then Russia, later soon to be the Soviet Union, that he is, by virtue of his debt to his ancestors, obligated to support only one public policy position, and that is uncontrolled mass immigration from anybody around the world who wants to come here because otherwise he is violating his Jewish heritage. Now, Matt might want to comment on the fact that the intervening creation of the State of Israel might have changed that dynamic in terms of how American Jews perceive this issue. But Matt, what about this whole proposition? Stephen Miller's uncle says that the law, had it been in effect when his great-grandfather came in, who apparently was a successful businessman, that they wouldn't have been allowed to come in. I mean, the law really was the same as Mr. Miller's proposing, isn't that right?
It's a ridiculous premise. The law that is being pushed by the Trump administration, the policies, were actually put in effect starting in 1882, running through the Immigration Acts up to the 1952 changes. So this whole notion that if the immigration policies that Stephen Miller is supporting were in effect, he never would have been born in this country is completely false, because the very policies that he's advocating were in effect. The 1903 Immigration Act, which was the year the Gosler family arrived here, actually was the first act to make anarchists and beggars inadmissible to the United States. Why? Because average Americans at that point in time understood that people who want to violently overthrow the government of the United States who aren't willing to work to support themselves simply don't belong here.
So the whole idea that people should not be admitted unless they have the ability to support themselves is not a new idea.
No, it's not a new idea at all. As a matter of fact, it goes back to the time of the colonies.
Really, even before that, maybe back to Britain, right?
That's correct.
Also, why then should Stephen Miller be attacked by his uncle? And is there any precedent for this in American politics, where you have a family member of an administration official, going back in your knowledge of U.S. history, attacking a relative that he hardly knows because he believes that his religion or ethnicity precludes him from taking that position?
Not that I'm aware of, and it's a silly argument. Just because your relatives happen to come here as immigrants, lawful immigrants who worked and were successful, doesn't mean that you should support the mass admission of poor people who broke the law to get here. It's just a ridiculous premise.
Well, we want to salute Stephen Miller for being able to think independently, not being culture bound, if you will, by the importunings of misguided family members who may believe that outmoded ideas are applicable to today. And Stephen Miller has brought a lot of innovative thinking to this administration. And we certainly appreciate the fact that taking this kind of heat from family members publicly, who are doing this at your expense, cannot be an easy thing for him. But really what Matt is also saying is that the principle of public charge, the principle of the idea that people should only be admitted if they can carry their weight, is an old principle. It is a principle that's been around since the founding of the colonies, through much of American history. And that I think, Matt, you would bear out this idea, that the idea that immigrants are admitted without the ability to support themselves, in all likelihood going to become dependent on public services, that this is a relatively new feature in the American landscape, right? Historically, people had to pay their own way.
That's 100% correct. And if we take a look at just one example, the Census Bureau does a survey of income and program participation. And the most recent version of that survey revealed that approximately 50% of households currently headed by an immigrant use some form of welfare. That's shocking.
50% of current immigrant-headed households are using some form of welfare. So clearly, the law that says if you're going to be a public charge, not being enforced.
That's correct. What we've essentially done is we've turned the United States into a retirement plan for people who have fallen on economic hard times. And what's even more shocking...
Well, they get off eventually. Don't they get off eventually off public assistance?
They don't.
They
About
don't get
90% of them are likely to remain on public assistance after 20 years. So those same
90%
households...
are still on welfare after 20 years?
20 years. That's a long time to be on public assistance and not working.
So really, when the administration says we're going to revive these rules, let's say you can't go on welfare if you want a green card, we're just simply going back to the norm. We're actually going back to the traditional view, making immigration help America again.
Well, we're going back to a time when immigration helped America, but also a time when Americans believed that a fundamental American value was working for yourself, and people considered it inappropriate, as a matter of fact, a moral failing, to become dependent upon the state rather than working to support yourself and your family.
So these new rules, when are they coming out? These are proposed rules, right? Already going to be a lot of opposition, but when are they coming out?
Well, it remains to be seen. The administration has not said exactly when they are going to propose them. One hopes that after it's gotten past the Supreme Court nomination, that this will then become a priority.
Now, Medicaid, okay, we've seen Medicaid use skyrocket among the foreign-born. What do we know about the impact of these rules on Medicaid use by non-citizens?
So clarifying the public charge rules could reduce the number of immigrants enrolled in Medicaid by up to 1.1 million within the next 10 to 12 years.
Well, that would save taxpayers billions, right?
It would save taxpayers as much as $6.4 billion. That's a staggering amount.
Well, why should Americans support mass immigration when so many of them are going on welfare and there's opposition to changing the rules so they have to work and pay their own way?
Well, the fact is they shouldn't, and what we've essentially done is we've set up a system where Americans pay taxes for these benefit programs, but it's not Americans who are collecting the benefits. It's people who are being brought in from outside of the United States, and you can't admit 1 million mostly poor legal immigrants and God knows how many illegal immigrants every year and expect the country not to go bankrupt.
So the Cato Institute, they don't seem to understand what it means to have a large welfare state and mass immigration, right? But didn't Milton Friedman have an observation about that?
He did. Milton Friedman
Famous
warned...
economist, Nobel Prize-winning economist out of the University of Chicago, considered the founder of monetarism. For those of you not familiar with Milton Friedman's work, very influential among libertarians, but he understood something that the Cato Institute apparently does not, which is what?
Well, he famously said it's just obvious that you can't have free immigration and a welfare state. And I
well, you
think
bankrupt this community, right?
That's
National
correct.
Bankruptcy.
He was observing what Margaret Thatcher once famously said: the trouble with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money.
Trouble with socialism, it doesn't work. Trouble with socialism is most people who use the term in this country don't know what it means. Certainly don't know what the impact is over time. So the way these regulations are known, they're called public charge rules. They're rules that simply say if you're going to get on welfare, you don't get a green card. They give authority to consular offices overseas to deny applications for permanent residence. They also can be used to deny adjustment of status to people who've been on welfare extensively. And it's hard to imagine, I know, for most of you out there, but if somebody comes in here and they're working, let's say they're working as a cafeteria worker in a public school, and they have 3 or 4 kids in public school, what's the probability they're going to still be on public assistance even though they're working?
Well, it's pretty significant because both the Clinton and the Obama administrations broadened the public charge exemptions to allow people to collect more and different types of benefits than they previously had been. The theory was that if people were the working poor, they should be able to collect benefits to subsidize their inability to earn a living. But that's exactly the problem. We should be recruiting people to come to the United States who are capable of supporting themselves.
Well, David said there's a huge difference between getting help and taking advantage of the system. Don't we want to help people who, through unforeseeable situations, might need help?
Certainly we do, but the fact is when you have 50% of immigrant-headed households on public assistance, and after 10 years, 20 years, 90% of them still remain there, that's getting a freebie, not getting assistance.
So really, in the end, it's employers who benefit because they get to pay lower wages. Obviously, the immigrants themselves benefit because they're getting to come here, they get the public benefits, they get American jobs in some cases also. And so who's paying the bill?
Well, the working people in the United States, and it's borne most heavily
The working people whose bargaining leverage is eroded by the presence of all these foreign-born workers.
That's 100% correct. And this is borne most heavily by the people in the middle classes and people at the lower end of the working professional spectrum, because the people who are extremely wealthy don't pay taxes in a lot of circumstances. So the tax burden falls most heavily on people that are collecting a salary, and in most cases wind up paying something in the neighborhood of 48 to 54% of their income out in both state and federal taxes.
So we have very powerful people pushing to sustain both illegal immigration and the incredibly expensive high cost of unskilled labor, essentially, even through legal channels, right? These powerful institutions are redistributing wealth. We're all paying the tab, right?
That's correct. And the problem with the approach that the Cato Institute takes is they claim that they're a market-based approach and that if we open up the labor market, everything will correct itself. But they don't take into account the fact that a lot of these businesses are receiving government subsidies already. So if you take agriculture, agriculture is constantly complaining that they want more immigrant labor because they can't find people to work at the wages they're paying. But before they even get to paying people, most of the agricultural industry is receiving all kinds of government price supports and assistance.
And on top of that, they want special subsidies. And this is in order to basically have food grown in this country? Is that the argument?
That's correct.
Otherwise, we'd import the food.
Correct.
And they claim it's for national security that we have to have food grown here.
That's correct. But
isn't there a cheaper way to get this done besides having agriculture? Agriculture opposes E-Verify, right? I mean, not all agriculture. The Western growers, the Farm Bureau, they oppose it, even though most Americans and most agricultural communities support E-Verify, the program to make sure people are here lawfully, right, in order to get an American job. But not the Western growers, not the Farm Bureau. They are opposing important and needed reforms. Most of what the Trump administration is trying to do on the border, interior, everything else, because they say if we have stronger enforcement, then they need a very expensive guest worker program, which in all likelihood will not be properly enforced and which people will also wind up using welfare. There's a lot of disagreement among our viewers and great comments, by the way, coming in. I'm reading them all about where illegal immigrants work, where recent immigrants work, why they don't make more money, essentially, to be able to make enough so they don't also need welfare. But most low-skill immigrants are working in fields all across the country. I mean, in different disciplines. They're not just working in agriculture. They could be working in food processing, working in service industries, right?
That's correct.
Those
Construction.
where you're illegally are mostly working construction fields and that, right? Mostly?
Right, but those are typically the industries. If you look at construction, a lot of projects that are done in major cities receive all kinds of taxpayer assistance under the guise of they are economic drivers. But the problem is, as soon as you start putting those artificial restrictions on the market, you skew the whole system. And a simpler way to make this all work better would be to take those artificial subsidies away from the system and let the market set the wage for American workers.
So let the market work internally.
Correct.
But don't let immigration from outside the country distort the labor market.
Correct.
I suppose you've seen the ads that we're running up there, right? I hope you've all seen them out there. They're running all over the internet right now for wages to rise. Immigration must fall. Do you think that's a good formulation?
I think it's a good formulation. The fact is that if we want to raise wages for American workers, then we need to reduce the number of competitors who are coming in who are willing to work for lower wages. And one of the most effective ways to do that is to implement a merit-based immigration system that focuses on people's ability to speak English and job skills that are needed in the U.S. economy so that
Under reasonable numerical caps.
Correct. And we want to bring in people who are filling jobs that we can't fill internally, not people who are going to compete with American workers for current jobs.
All right, well, we think it's very probable this issue will continue to percolate through November. Chris Kobach worked for a long time with our affiliated Immigration Reform Law Institute, helped bring a number of important cases defining the proper role between the local governments and the federal government in enforcing laws, helping to craft laws that were designed to undermine these so-called sanctuary efforts that really undermine federal immigration enforcement. He won. Today it was announced Chris Kobach has won the nomination for governor in the state of Kansas, Republican nominee, and we look forward to watching his campaign over the course of the next several months come November. Immigration will be an issue all across the country. A ballot initiative has qualified in Oregon, which FAIR was supportive of and assisted in many ways. That will be on the ballot in November. No question about it, immigration will be a major factor in the upcoming election. You want to be staying tuned to FAIR, our Twitter feed, our social media feed, Facebook feed. We've got great folks here who take care of that. All our research reports, follow what we're doing, follow what our Immigration Reform Law Institute is doing as well. This is Matt O'Brien, our Director of Research. I want to thank him for joining me. And again, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to what we have to say. This is another FAIR Facebook Live. I'm Dan Stein. Thank you for joining.